So we guess we'll get started. I think it is, oh, it's just 1 minute to 12. But we already have quite a few people, most people joined us. So I think I might just do the introduction now and then we can get started on time. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Helena Stage. Yeah, okay, we'll go with that. Who has just started a Alexandra von Humboldt Fellowship at the University of Potsdam and the Humboldt-Universität of Berlin. Apologies for my terrible English pronunciations. Previously to this, Helena was based at the University of Manchester and she was working with Ian Hall, Thomas House and Lorenzo Pellis there. So Helena has been involved throughout the pandemic in modelling various different aspects, and in particular she's been a very valuable part of the INI working group on COVID-19 and higher education, which is with all the universities going back is rather busy again. And today she is going to be speaking to us about cluster outbreaks. Are they isolated incidents and how can they be managed? So with that, I will pass over to you, Helena, and thank you very much for doing the talk today.
Thanks, Kira. I'm going to try and be a very, very inferior version of Petra. I don't think anyone can replace Petra, but I will try and fail, but here we are. So as Kira said, I used to be a postdoc at Manchester, and this is work that I've been obsessing about since mid-2020. And so the work that's come out of this is in collaboration with the Manchester COVID-19 modeling group, the INI higher education modeling group that's been mentioned earlier today already in the talks we've had this morning, and also has been part of conversations that have happened with Public Health England. I would have put the little logos of the different universities to make it easier, but turns out in true German fashion, you have to fill out paperwork so that the logo can be represented on the slide in the correct format, etc. So I'm afraid you get a very boring blue slide. Apologies for that, but never, perhaps an amusing anecdote at least. It can be amusing to someone else and not the person dealing with the emails. Anyway, moving on. Clusters. So the two big questions that keep coming up when we think about cluster outbreaks is, how do they come about? Are they always caused by the same set of circumstances? And then there's the concern about, well, if we have this large outbreak in a cluster, how much will the surrounding community be impacted? And what can we do about that? That means in general that you do a lot of outbreak investigation modeling with lots of detail. For those who were at Emily's talk earlier today, when she spoke about the different structures of a university, for example, with schools, etc., that's the kind of level that you sometimes get down to in trying to understand how an outbreak might happen. What I want to talk about today here is not so much the specifics of the cluster outbreaks themselves, although I have done work on that. So if people in the end turn out to be more interested in those particular examples, we can discuss. But I want to talk about some of the commonalities I've observed in looking at a number of different cluster outbreaks and what we can learn from them. And so I have two perspectives on this. The first is looking at outbreaks in German meatpacking plants, both in terms of the testing strategies that were there, how they worked, how they didn't work, and how the community was affected there. And then moving to the UK, what we saw in some universities, the challenges that come with modeling universities. Again, Emily's touched on a number of those, so thanks, Emily. I won't have to repeat myself. And how's the student community interaction perhaps different? So just to be clear, I will not be doing the specific modeling of all the different clusters of the plants of each university and so on, because I think we're close to lunchtime, so let's keep it light. So let's start at a German meatpacking plant. And oh, I don't know what's happening. Can people see it? Yeah, okay. So there's a lot of text there, don't worry about that. I'm just going to talk through it. Obviously, all meatpacking plants are in black and white. This is how they look. And I think the hat is also compulsory. No, so the example I want to look at is the meatpacking plant industry in it's generally, most of them are located in the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia over towards the west. And it's the same area that's unfortunately had a lot of flooding recently. And so one of the largest plants there of about 7,000 employees had a very large outbreak in the summer of 2020. And at the time of that outbreak, the state policy in the region was that all workers were to be tested on a monthly basis. This is asymptomatic testing with PCR. And in addition to that, if any employees did present with symptoms, they could individually seek out a test if they wanted to. Unfortunately, and this is going to be a theme, workers who tested positive and therefore were required to self-isolate were not compensated financially for that duration when they were not working. And so it's expected that there probably was some barrier in the testing uptake that one might have hoped for. Now, obviously the picture there is not the plant in question, but to give you an idea of the kind of working conditions that you have on the floor of one such plant, you're usually standing shoulder to shoulder next to other people in an environment that's relatively cool to keep the products fresh. And so that means it can be challenging to maintain social distancing if that's even possible. So that's one group. Those are the people who are on the floor, if you will. And there's another group of people who are the ones who who work in transportation management and administration for those plants. They generally are residents of the area who probably grew up nearby. In the case of this particular plant, they live in the community in households of 2 to 4 people. Whereas the workers who are in these plants often come from parts of Eastern Europe and live in housing provided by the employers. So in this particular example that we're going to look at today, in mid-June of 2020, about 1,000 workers were randomly sampled for testing, and a very high test positivity from that resulted in a mass shutdown of the facility and mass testing, first of the workers and later on also of the surrounding community if they so desired to get a test. And during that entire period, and we're talking about a bit less than 2 weeks, all of the workers were quarantined in their homes. They were actually fenced in. The military came and put up barriers. And at the time they could not leave, but local residents did visit those areas to provide essential supplies like food and toiletry and so on. So what actually happened? Well, it looks a little bit like this. So what you're looking at here on the left-hand side, we've got data for people who work in the food industry in that state. So that's the gray. And then we've got the background community in that same area in red, and you can see, hopefully here, the massive spike, which is when we have the recorded outbreak in the plant. And so what we're actually seeing is a period of low monitoring early on in early June, and then later on in early July, and then this period of high monitoring in the middle with mass testing. And so there are a few things to notice just at looking at the growth rates and the trends in the data from this initial investigation. And that's firstly that there isn't actually that big of a difference in the relative cases outside of the outbreak when we compare the community and the food industry workers. But we do see a growth in cases in the community that coincides with the period of high cases amongst the workers. Obviously, correlation is not causation, but that's a pattern that we observe. The other thing to point out from this is that we did observe an increase in incidence after the outbreak was brought under control. So in July, cases are no longer growing in either community, but there is a higher incidence in the community, roughly 30% or so. That's not to say, and I want to be very, very clear about this from the outset, that's not to say that that 30% is the impact that a cluster outbreak will have on the community. At best, it's an upper bound, but just to notice that there is that increase in the incidence following the outbreak. Okay, for those who listened to me ramble before, I like questions. If there are questions, if someone has something about a particular slide, if it's particularly relevant, maybe Kira or someone can jump in and say, I don't mind. But just to point out, questions are very welcome. I like questions. Please ask questions. Oh, and now it's not letting me change. Okay, so like I said at the beginning, you can do very, very detailed outbreak investigation modeling for this. You can build up a structured model with some assumptions about what the household structure would have been for the workers and for the community. You can separate the population into those who work on the floor and those who work in other parts of the plant, and you can look at the interactions between the two. I have done that, but that is not what I want to talk about, because it turns out when you're just interested, which is what I want to talk about today, in how the cluster affects the community, that much more detailed model, it will give you a better idea, it'll better capture what will happen inside of the cluster, but in terms of the improvement that you see in actually estimating the impact on the community, doesn't do that much better. So I want to stick to a very simple model here of just interactions between two particular groups. And so this is what you see here. In blue, blue is going to represent the workers in the cluster, and red is going to represent the community, so everyone who is not an employee at the plant. And so we consider susceptible individuals, individuals who are infected but not yet infectious, individuals who are infectious but not yet symptomatic, individuals who are infectious and symptomatic, and people who have either been quarantined or they've recovered. And I should say, even though there's only one compartment each here, there is a distribution, a gamma distribution of the, there is a gamma distribution of the incubation period, and we do account for the time distribution of the pre-symptomatic period as well. So this is just a rough cartoon of the kind of states that we consider in the model. And so the part that's going to capture the variable testing that we have in the cluster outbreak, and again, we can't really get around that given this massive spike, is when we actually do testing. And so testing, because asymptomatic testing is offered to the workers, occurs for individuals in the shaded compartments. In other words, we allow for a person who is pre-symptomatic to potentially be identified as a case, as well as people who are symptomatic and infectious, with a time varying probability of them actually being tested, P of T. And we assume that in the community, people are only tested if they actually have symptoms. So the way that we assume that these two populations interact with each other is through a force of infection. And in the case of the cluster, that's a relatively standard form, except we allow for the infectivity beta here to vary with time to account for perhaps changes in mixing that happens, in particular during mass quarantine, for example. And we allow for the community to have the same kind of force of infection. So again, these two populations are identical in terms of the structure, except subscript C denotes that same quantity for the community compared to the cluster. So C is community, C is not cluster, C is community. And we assume that there's a contribution to the force of infection by the infectious individuals in the cluster, scaled by some constant alpha here. And so alpha is going to be our proxy for how much of the infectious potential, if you will, of the cluster is going to actually affect the wider community. A few points to note about this. I'm assuming, and that should be clear from the direction of these arrows, that seeding does not happen the other way. So seeding doesn't happen from the community to the cluster. So this is a worst case scenario, if you will, of just a community that tries to avoid the cluster, but the cluster somehow still manages to seed some infection to the community. But the other thing I haven't included, which you really should include, especially if you're looking at the within cluster dynamics, is the changing infectivity. So the viral load, how that affects the infectivity of an individual, and in turn, how that affects the probability of a false positive or a false negative. So in this particular case, the sensitivity and specificity I've assumed are just here below as constants. Okay. Is that all clear to everyone? That's sort of what we're working with? I'm going to assume yes. Okay. So what does, oh, don't leave my, okay. So this is what you get. And as you'd expect from the very simple structure that I gave you before, the fit that you see for the model output here with the inside of the cluster in blue here is not great. It's also not terrible, but it captures the salient feature that we've got a steady growth and a steady decay in cases leading up to and after the outbreak, and then you've got some jumping cases in the middle. This can be improved if you give more information about exactly how the testing took place, but then at that point, you're basically telling the model what happens and feels a little bit like cheating. So I've elected to keep the simple model like this to begin with. So some key things to point out about this cluster, just to give you an idea of what happens. The RT at peak incidence, so when the cluster is really growing at its fastest, you've got an RT of almost 4. And during the period where you have high monitoring, it's estimated that case finding is at about 97–98%, as opposed to approximately 40% case finding in normal times. So think these two periods over here. The more interesting part, to me at least, is this other way that we can perhaps try to quantify the relationship between these two populations is what's alpha. And so just to remind you again, assuming the screen, no, assuming the screen will let me, alpha is this parameter here that guides the contribution of the cluster to the community. And so in this particular very simple model, so again, this should not be taken as actual true gospel of the true magnitude, but it's an indicator roughly of what the contribution might be. It's not very large, but there's a high uncertainty in the actual estimate because there's such a high uncertainty in what's happening in the cluster for this particular model setup. But what this suggests, looking at the value of the parameter, is that we likely have minor amounts of seeding from the cluster to the community, but not continued feedback and not a very, very large effect. And that's consistent if we think about just the fit of the model. Again, very rough because I've chosen not to include details. There are things like weekend effects that have been mentioned earlier today as well. This is just a very rough toy model to look at what happens. A small amount of seeding is consistent with us seeing a small growth in the incidence and that then stabilizing to a higher, roughly constant incidence.
Helena, sorry, I don't mean to jump in, but
no.
Desmond had a question. So he said, could you share more about why you've chosen an SEPIR model and what are the advantage of including another P compartment? And how about people who have never become symptomatic?
Oh, so the fact that I don't have a constant. Okay, so I think if I understand correctly, there are two questions there. Why? So why is it SEPIR? Is that for the community or the cluster or both? I guess I can try to answer. So the advantage of having an SEPIR model is the fact that I somehow want to capture the variability in testing. So with regular testing of the workers, if they are infectious and therefore have enough viral load that a test could potentially identify them, that's my assumption at least, having a P compartment altogether is helpful to actually capture that there's potentially asymptomatic testing going on, which won't be the case in the community. And I felt like, because I'm using the same distribution of the incubation period and wanting to preserve as many of the fundamental, even if it's a simple model, the fundamental features of the lifetime of the infection in the population, I wanted to keep the structure of what that pathway might be comparable in those two populations. As for why I have two P compartments in the so that's why I have two P compartments, both in the community and in the cluster. The fact that there is a time variability in the duration of how long the pre-symptomatic period lasts is just from having looked at the literature and some literature reviews on how long that period lasts. And it seemed a relatively simple extension to make, though of course all of this hinges on assumptions about what the incubation period might be, the potential serial interval, and so on. So there are definitely some questions and some flaws with the model, but there are flaws that's, I think, still let us find the base features of what we're trying to look at.
And just following on, Helena, another question related, I think, to these two slides. Jordan asks that case finding of approximately 40% seems very high for monthly testing in a relatively young population. So you just wondered where you got this number from.
Yeah, so case finding, so bear in mind, so case finding is only in the cluster across, so the data we have here includes all plants in the region. It will not only include one plant, otherwise obviously we'd expect these numbers to go to zero after the outbreak is managed. This is across this entire population and how the plant worker community, surrounding community populations interact. So case finding is, if I go back here, there is this P of T that we've got. So P of T is estimated given known data from the outbreak with priors from the contact tracing information that is available. It is available, it's also incomplete. So there are some limitations to how much we should trust that prior, but this is case finding among random staggered sampling asymptomatically of the workers. So it's not everyone just deciding that they might want to get a test. It's people who are being told by their employer, before you go into work today, we're going to pull you aside. You're going to have a test alongside however many other people we've selected for testing that day. So that's why the number is so high. I hope that answers the question. So it's a combination of using contact tracing data as a prior and then an estimate from the data. And I can, if you want, I can go into more technical details about how the estimation happens. But I hope that's okay. I'm going to assume as much unless I hear otherwise. One thing I do want to mention about these estimates is that the largest sensitivity, and this goes back to Jordan's question, I think the largest sensitivity in these estimates, because this model is not perfect, I'm not claiming it to be, the largest sensitivity is in how we assume the durations in each phase. So how long are you exposed? How long are you pre-symptomatic? And the likely, that is the biggest trade-off in how long you could potentially be caught by mass testing versus what we estimate the efficacy to be. And so it may be that it would be more sensible to fine-tune this even more to the ages of the particular workers. Unfortunately, despite all the data I have about this particular cluster outbreak, the age distribution is one of the things I don't have. But I think there were only 4 hospitalizations among the workers themselves. So yes, it is generally on average a young population. I don't think anyone was above the age of 50 of those working on the floor. That's not true for those who worked in administration and management in the plant. Okay, hopefully that is clear. So a rough summary just of what comes out of this initial look at the outbreak is that there are many confounding effects. So on one hand, I've shown you that while the incidence stabilizes again after the outbreak, it goes up by about 30%. On the other hand, I've given an alpha value that's very low, albeit it goes up to about 10%-ish. But I want to be very clear that these are just bounds, if you will, on our heuristic interpretation of how these populations interact with each other. It is not an end-all result, and I have not included things like NPIs and other things happening in the background population. So just to say that there are many confounding effects in place. How the particular values that we see here very much depend on how the cluster and the community are linked, and we're going to get back to that. In this case here, both of the results and qualitatively what we're just seeing looking at the data as well suggest that these clusters, even with a large outbreak among a plant that has 7,000 workers, the seeding that does happen, if it does occur, is quite limited. To give you one example from the contact tracing, I think 10 people were infected because they happened to go to church with an employee at the plant who unknowingly had COVID at the time and attended the sermon. So those are the kinds of places where some of the spillover might happen. The other thing to notice is that there is no correlation between what we observe in the cluster and what we see in the community after about 3 weeks. So there's a time horizon on this, disregarding knock-on effects and more subtle phenomena that are happening that, again, are not included in this simple version. And another thing I haven't touched on here, because again, it's a simpler model, but it does bear out in a more complicated model I have of the outbreak at this particular plant, is that the secondary attack rate within the household, so not so much at the time when people were still allowed to go to work, because more mixing happens at work than at home, but during the time period where mass quarantine was in effect, because many of these workers share residence, because the residences are endorsed or provided by the employers, a lot of transmission happened within the household while some individuals were trying to self-isolate just because of practical limitations in the ability of doing so. The specific details of the household structure are not known. I've made some assumptions about what that might look like from information I was able to get from this particular plot, but to give you a rough idea of how testing might help, and I think we generally know this at this point, it's not news, more testing generally helps manage things, but if you're smart in these high-risk mixy settings, if you're smart about testing, you can reduce or suppress an outbreak by about 50% if your sampling was more frequent instead of in bulk every few weeks, and being careful about sampling people from different households as you do so, under the assumption that if one person from a household is infected, likely a number of other individuals in that household are also infected. But there are some practical drawbacks to that as well. I should also mention that besides the barriers to uptake among workers in testing, which I mentioned, for example, the financial compensation, there are also barriers from employers in terms of insufficient guidance or guidance that keeps changing, so lack of clarity, and also in this particular case, the employers being expected to foot the bill for the testing, which doesn't necessarily encourage as frequent testing as you might hope if tests were infinitely available and free. So that's the first part. And I want to now just talk about how university outbreaks are similar and also not similar at all. But if there are any questions about the plant outbreaks, now is your time, or you can wait until the end. I'm assuming people are waiting until the end. Okay, so unis. Emily gave an excellent overview of this earlier, and she also mentioned lots of different very good papers on it, so that means I don't have to. I also know that there are a number of people here who've been looking at cases in schools. And so what I'm going to give up front is all the ways in which schools and colleges are not the same as universities. And they're also not meatpacking plants. And the main difference there is how the two populations are actually linked. So what I mean by that, it's what kind of campus we might have. So in the UK at least, campus size, so this is the number of students who you would expect to be on campus any given week, disregarding places that have mostly distance learning. You can have anywhere from 1,000 to 40,000 students-ish. There's high variability in where the student's country of origin is, which brings into questions about seeding of new infections, that is. There's variability in the catchment area. So do you mostly have local students or students who are parts of the mass migration that Emily spoke about? And if they're locally up, do they then live in halls of residence, or are they commuter students? And then there's a question that I think was also raised earlier today, which is, where is the campus located? Is it in the middle of a city center? Is it not? And is the university located in a university town, for example, or is it more, is it a very, very large city that also just happens to have some universities? And all of those questions also feed into where the students live. So do they usually get smaller houses? Is it a university that has a large number of halls of residence, which means the students are more likely to use those? So those are all the many ways in which universities are never like each other. And because this isn't enough, and we must make things more complicated because things are always more complicated, 18 to 24-year-olds, who are the ones who on average are the majority of the student population, they're highly likely to be asymptomatic. But asymptomatic testing was not widely offered across all universities in 2020. In fact, when we look at the number of cases in that age range that were reported to be asymptomatic, although there are a number of caveats and issues with this number, so let's not take it as gospel, it's between 6 and 13%. Then there are questions about biasing in participation. So usually first years tend to participate more in testing, at least early on. But across all years, there was a significant decline in test presentation during term. And I can talk more about that later if we want. There are some practical issues as well in terms of doing the analysis that I don't want to go into too much. But the one point I do want to highlight here very, very early on is, if there is a large outbreak on campus, it is not necessarily the fault of the student. They may have been trying to self-isolate, but have, for practical reasons, been unable to do so. Or despite doing so, the situation was such that infection still occurred. So that's point number one. And just because infections happen in a university student population does not mean that they happened on campus. It may simply be because of how they mix and how they and where they live and the number of people with whom they live. So very big things up front, just to bear in mind. Let's not go blaming all uni students for wanting an education. So, will this let me change slide? It will, good. So again, I've actually done modeling of a university, very detailed, similar to what Emily mentioned in her model. Sadly, the university I modeled for will not let me present any of the data. So I'm going to show this with public data instead. And I'm not at all salty about this, but moving on. So let's consider the fact that we now have universities, and some of them unfortunately have outbreaks. This is all from 2020. So let's first consider a town A. And town A is a relatively small university. It has a large number of local students. And at the time of the outbreak, the community infection prevalence was about average for the country. And what we see looking at the entire age range of 18 to 24-year-olds is we see, so this is rescaled relative to the populations in that particular town. we see a peak in the student cases. And after the peak in student cases go down, we see that there is an increase in the growth rate of cases in the wider community. So this is not proof of an effect of the university outbreak on the community, but it's a hint that something might be happening there. And if we look at the age split for this particular town by ages 18, 19, and 20 to 24, so trying to disentangle perhaps some people who are still in secondary school who are 18 and trying to separate first and second year students who more likely live in Hall than older years, we see that there's higher infection amongst the 18 and 19-year-olds, and then the 20 to 24-year-olds are a bit lower down, but there's not that big a difference. So let's contrast that with town B. So this is town B. Town B, as you can see, had a higher infection amongst those aged 18 to 24. And we can also see that relative to the 20 to 24 year age group, infections were higher amongst those aged 18 or 19 than we saw in the previous town. Now, the difference between town A and town B is that town A contains a large university with a much wider international catchment than B. And it was also in a region at the time that had a higher level of infection prevalence in the community. What we don't see in B is any statistically significant increase in the growth rate after a peak in student cases. We do see, and it's a bit hard because of the way I've rescaled things, but what we do see is we see an excess in community cases relative to what this very simple model predicts. Shortly after, we see the massive outbreak in the student-aged population. So that's the hint we see here, that there's perhaps more cases than we'd expect in that particular week. There are a number of caveats with both of these plots that I'm showing you. Firstly, not everything aged 18 to 24 is a university student. And this also doesn't include mature students. And this also doesn't correct for variable testing rates, which we know were a key factor, nor does this account for changes in the community prevalence during this time. So these are just observations and some correlations, but this is not causally linked. Okay, so what if we, instead of looking at ages, look at geography? So this is again A and B, but instead of looking at the ages now, let's look at where the cases are geographically. So we're going to look at MSOAs. And thank you, Chris, because that means I don't have to explain what an MSOA is now. So we're going to look at, we're going to separate MSOAs into a few different categories. So using information from HESA, we are going to estimate which MSOAs have a high proportion of university students. And we're going to say that's anywhere that has more than 15%. And then we're also going to consider how these MSOAs are located spatially. So any MSOA that has a center within 2 kilometers of an MSOA with a high concentration of students is defined as being near high concentration, and so on. And so in A, we see that there is an increase in cases that rises faster first in the gray MSOA here that's known to have a high concentration of students. And then later on, we see a rise in cases in other MSOAs. Whereas in B, we see we again see the sharp rise in the MSOAs with a high concentration of students. And then we see sort of a signal or a wave of that peak in cases then spreading to other MSOAs that are nearby, and then those that are further away have very low concentration of students, don't really see an effect. So what does this tell us? Well, firstly, there's a lot of variability in this. And so it's very difficult to quantify anything consistently. So all I've shown you so far are 2 case studies. If we try and look at this a bit more generally, and here we're considering a few more different universities, there is a massive amount of heterogeneity according to how you look at the data. So what we've looked at here is, okay, let's assume for argument's sake, perhaps, that this excess that I mentioned in town B, that happens after there's a peak in the university age population, and let's constrain that to be 2 generation times after the peak of the outbreak. Let's look at what the excess is relative to the expected number of cases that we see in the community, and let's try to plot that to make a comparison across different locations to see if we can find any kind of trend. And so that's the y-axis that you see here. The problem with this is, even for these 2 towns where we have a fair amount of information, we know how old people are who get infected, we know their location, but even that is not enough to actually get agreement in terms of what the size of the outbreak is. And that goes back to problems I've mentioned about testing and variable testing uptake across the country. So just looking at 2 different definitions of reported cases in that particular town, this is the variability that we see. And the other thing to notice, which is perhaps the most important thing to notice, is in some cases we have an excess, which if we accept that this may correlate with spillover, which it needn't, it doesn't always happen, right? So you can have large outbreaks in a particular town that has a university without necessarily seeing this effect in the community. And so unfortunately, this means that we can, even when we do a case study of a particular town and we try to understand, well, okay, so some have more local students, some have more international students, can we find a pattern in what happens? We can't. And even the heterogeneity in the other factors that I mentioned earlier, like what the incidence is at the time of the peak in infection, how many local students there are, where do they live? All of those questions, even accounting for those, does not give us a clear trend here. So something more is going on when we're trying to understand how the community and the student populations interact. In other words, there are some confounders. And while we have some typical examples, there are also counterexamples, right? So one of the things that we do see consistently, for example, is that cases are higher among 18 to 19-year-olds. And those are people who more often live in halls of residence. Some people have done some really amazing work looking at what happens in halls specifically. There's one paper there I can point to, but there are a number of others. I'm going to posit a hypothesis, and it is only a hypothesis because it is one pattern that sometimes is robust, but it's the most robust thing I've found yet. I'm not saying this is a general rule. It is a hypothesis, and it only comes out of the study of these 2 particular towns, A and B. But there are some things that we can see. When we looked at the age stratified incidence per 100,000 in A, there was a smaller difference, if you remember, between those aged 18 and 19 and those who were in their 20s. And that was also a place that had more local students and more commuter students, and therefore fewer students in halls, which suggests that halls generally allow for an easier spark in infections to happen, and it can be harder to contain once they're there, which is also not rocket science, which is why I'm comfortable putting that up there. What we actually see in terms of the effect of the community is far more tenuous. Again, this is only a hypothesis, and it's something I'm working more on that I welcome thoughts on. But town A that had more local students didn't see a massive sharp spike in cases after the peak. There was an increase in the growth rate in community cases. So it may be, again, it's a hypothesis that there's more feedback in that cluster that is more integrated with the community compared to a place like town B that had a much higher outbreak, but a much smaller proportion of local students. It's only a question for further investigation. I want to be very clear on that, but it's something that's perhaps worth looking into. Again, like with the outbreak in plants, the effects that we saw in excess cases or increases in growth rate in the community, again, were transient, and they disappeared within 1 to 3 weeks. So at least this way of looking at the interactions between the students and the community populations doesn't suggest a long-term impact of an outbreak if that outbreak is managed or suppressed. The thing that makes this a bit more difficult to quantify is that we know that participation in testing declined very rapidly over the course of term. Generally, once the outbreak was mostly suppressed, the participation in testing also went down rather rapidly. And this suggests strong self-regulatory behavior in the community, in the student population. And so that's what I've been thinking about the last few months. So what you're looking at here is anonymized data. I won't tell you where from, but it pertains to, we have longitudinal data for a population who have access to regular testing. And we also monitor the amount of cases that are recorded in that population. And in addition to that, we also have a proxy for the self-mixing in that population over time. And so naturally, you expect higher levels of mixing. So you have a beta of T mixing here due to specific events. I think most people will go to a Christmas party or New Year's Eve or national holidays. You expect people to be mixier. But outside of those special events, does the population self-regulate? Do people naturally reduce their behaviors if they see, their mixing behaviors if they see that incidence, for instance, is large? In other words, do we have a beta that's perhaps a function of the integral over recent cases, for example? And so what you're looking at here in the plot are cases over a very long time period. It spans several months. And so this spans both the imposition of tier 3 and lockdowns in England, but it also includes periods where those lockdowns were not there. And what we see is that in general, people are mixier when cases are low. This is not surprising, but there's also a minimum amount of mixing that seems to happen regardless of the number of cases that are around in the community. And so ways of accounting for that in models of testing is something I'm very interested in. I should note that it may be that in the cohort that it has been monitored here, it may be that it's different people who are doing the mixing to those who are showing up for testing. That I have not accounted for here. That's something else that's up for discussion. But the summary of what I want to talk about here is that clusters are tricky, but more than just being tricky, what we've seen and hopefully what I've shown with the university outbreaks is that even if you manage to do an outbreak investigation in one place, it seldom applies to another one. The clusters can affect the surrounding community. They don't necessarily, but it seems to be strongly related to how the two populations actually are linked with each other. So think back to my hypothesis of the difference in how we might see what is possibly a signal of spillover or interaction in town A versus town B. There's a time limit on this, at least in the way I've been looking at it, to about 3 weeks. But what we've learned both from the plots and also universities more generally is when testing is voluntary and symptoms-based, it is likely not enough to prevent an outbreak entirely, but obviously can be used to understand and control it. And what I'm working on now in more detail is trying to understand how self-regulation in mixing behaviors impacts the outcomes of what modelings of different testing scenarios to make recommendations for the best kind of testing, how those self-regulatory behaviors might impact the outcomes that we see from those scenarios. But I'm going to stop ranting there and welcome any questions or ideas. The bathtub is required, the beard not so much, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena. And it's good that you ended about testing, because somebody actually has written a question about testing. So Abel from SEMA, thank you very much for joining us today. So he says, using this model, how can we tactfully test people using minimal resources? And how do you determine how many tests, but also where to put them?
Is this for a university setting or for a plant? The timing is sort of halfway through the talk, so I'm not able to determine which of my rants it pertains to.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it might be also a slightly more general question, right? Of if you've got limited resources and you're trying to contain outbreaks within some kind of focused environment, how should you be determining where to put your tests?
Right. Well, it depends on where, on what you're trying to achieve. Right. So firstly, these clusters now, these clusters are larger than some of the ones we've seen recently, at least in the UK, and that's partly because of vaccination. So firstly, to bear in mind that the testing results that come out of what we might do now in this setting is different to what the recommendation might be in the absence of pharmaceutical interventions. What the modeling I've done specifically for campuses, taking into account age and course and what the size of the hall of residence and so on, suggests is that the amount of testing you want to put is not necessarily where students are mix here, but where they mix. So if everyone, if you have two, let's say for argument's sake, you have two large halls of residence, one is 10% larger, shall we say, than the other, but the other hall of residence perhaps has more space and is a place where more people will meet to actually mix and interact. If you have limited resources, it makes sense to target your testing to where you expect more of the mixing to happen, because the residence of where the mixing will occur will be the first point of contact to then trace back where the other students are coming from. So test the locus, if you will. But that is different if you're looking at a smaller university that is more integrated with the community. At that point, if you have a feedback loop, and I want to be clear, it's a hypothesis, it's not proven, but if you have more of that feedback loop with more students living at home, at that point, it's just a question of increasing testing uptake in the entire community, because the university is then just the place where some of that testing occurs, but it's not necessarily where the community will be most impacted, and in turn that will come back to the students afterwards. So it will depend on how integrated those two populations are, and sadly there is no clear one way of defining an integration metric of some kind. Integration is a terrible word to use when you're a mathematician, but hopefully you get what I mean.
Yeah, so it's not as simple as one size fits all. It's dependent on how much the two are kind of integrated with one another. And I like your term mixia.
Well, I stole it from Julia.
It's a great technical term. I think you should get it into a paper, as I want to see mixia in a paper. So we have some more questions. So David asks, with the self-regulation slide you showed at the end, do you still see a signal of increased activity with lower recent incidents when you account for changes in tiers, i.e. is there negative association still visible within tiers? Okay, so this is for one place, and so if there's a change in tier, it's only if that one place gets its tier changed. So the data in question is not from the last few months. And I think the other thing to point out there is the self-regulation we know varies with likely the self-perception of risk due to vaccination status. Among people, I think it's been shown, at least in surveys, although I think the exact numbers are a little bit unclear, but that people may engage in riskier behavior once they're vaccinated because they perceive themselves to be at lower risk. So the self-regulation, just in terms of
the tiers, if you separate the self-regulation to, if I understand the question correctly, it's, do people realize once they're in a different tier that things are more serious, and does that generally change the behavior? No. Not for this cohort, at least.
That's very interesting. And just on the self-regulation side of things, if people are interested, we have actually got an event coming up all about behaviour and COVID-19. So if people are interested, I will post a link in the chat if they want to find out more, which is kind of related to what you're talking about, self-regulation, people changing their behaviour because of what's happening around them, and us needing to incorporate that into the models. Yeah. So I think we've probably got time for one more question, because I know there's quite a few people at a Warwick event today that have to get back to some other talks. But so Christopher Watts says, how easy would it be to convert your models to study clusters in two types of relatively closed communities, so care home, prisons, and any guesses what changes in the model and what would stay the same?
Okay, so thinking of prisons, firstly, what the German military did in the meatpacking plants in Germany of fencing everyone in and not allowing them to leave, I can see the parallel there. I don't recommend doing that to university students, and I don't recommend doing that to people who are perhaps, I don't think I would want to do that to anyone in a care home, just from a moral or ethical perspective. I think I think the mental harm there, at least I would expect, would not be one that would make it something that you might want to consider. But that's just me on a personal note. In terms of prisons, the trouble with prisons, as I understand it, is that people can move between prisons, as do the employees. There is some parallel there also with the plants, with the meatpacking plants. And in fact, that was one of the things that happened. This is why there was this low level of incidence constantly throughout the entire period of study at the various meatpacking plants in that German state, because people will sometimes share a dormitory with, let's say, for example, 90% of the individuals who live there working at one plant, but maybe 10% work at another, also nearby, smaller plant. And so you can have cross-infection between populations who are in effectively in different workspaces and who you'd otherwise not expect to mix. So in terms of what you might want to do, the problem with prisons is also importation, right? You're going to have you're going to have, I mean, ideally not, but the fact is we do have continuous importation of people into prison as well. And so there's a question about seeding there, which is less of a concern during modeling of university outbreaks once the initial mass migration has happened. So you only worry about it at the beginning and end of term. You might be able to do some work for prisons, but it's not the same model. You would need to build an entirely different model that just contains some of the same features of the mixiness that you might see. So on the surface, I can see how they might be similar, but sadly not as much, I'd expect, when you get into the nitty-gritty. But we can talk more about that if you want.
Great, thank you very much. Are there any, I don't think there's any more questions. So as we're nearly at 1 o'clock, I just wanted to say a massive thank you, Helena. That was really interesting and very wide-ranging, and it was really great to hear about all your work and stuff. So, and if any of you have colleagues who couldn't make today, then this talk is being recorded and will be available on the INI website. So thank you very much, Helena. I will give the clap as no one else can. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and hopefully see you next month for our next seminar. Thank you, everyone.